Good afternoon, everyone. I see we have a few people joining us. They're all very welcome. Just give it another minute or two just as we're bringing everyone into the room. Good afternoon, everyone. I see more people are joining us. Let's just give it another couple of seconds. Great, I see some more. That's nearly there. Give it another few minutes. I'd like to see that number go up a few more minutes. Great, excellent. Okay, maybe we'll kick off just to be respectful of everyone's time. So good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to CCS's webinar, Instilling Confidence in Your Fundraising. My name is Maria. I'm a director with CCS, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we do get started. You have joined today's webinar by using the audio on your computer. If you would prefer to listen by phone, you can do so by clicking on phone call in the control panel and dial in to your preferred country will be there. Now, you have also joined us in listen only mode today, but we absolutely do want to hear from you throughout the session. So you can submit any questions, any comments by typing into the question panel on the right-hand side, or you can also send me a message directly. And ourselves in the panel will do their best to answer as many questions as they possibly can. So no further ado, joining me on today's call are my colleagues from CCS, Derval Costello and Charlie Michaud, who together will share their many years of experience working with nonprofit organizations. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Laura Boardman, Acting Deputy Chief Development Officer at Human Rights Watch. Laura has extensive experience working right across the nonprofit sector in the UK and internationally. She joined Human Rights Watch in 2004 and has since held many key leadership roles at the organization. So hopefully today, Laura, you'll share some tips, tricks, practical advice for our guests and talk about how you've achieved philanthropic growth at Human Rights Watch. Just before we do jump into the session, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible amount of change that we have had over the past number of years, and particularly that impact on fundraising. So Sam, I might just ask you to share a screen of a slide or two that we have. And often with a high level of change can come uncertainty, and this can lead, we know, to organizations or even individual fundraisers feeling that little bit paralyzed or standing still. And we've just taken a snapshot here of the current situation or the current environment as you may see it. And I'm sure a lot of you on the call will have heard from your donors versions of each of these, you know, around the rising cost of inflation, the continuing impact of COVID, and certainly what we're seeing unfolding in the Ukraine. However, we feel it's really important to balance all of that uncertainty with a lot of the positives. And Sam, you might just click over to some of the positives that we've been seeing in the past 2 years. Certainly the generosity of donors throughout COVID has been exceptionally impressive. We've seen a high level of new donors come into the fold with a new generation getting involved. And some of you may have seen a statistic coming out of Oxfam International recently that at the height of the pandemic, we saw over a billionaire every 30 hours being created, which is certainly linked to those slipping into poverty, but it just shows you how wealth generation is taking place. The industries, we know there's a high number of industries and companies that performed very well throughout COVID. So in all of this, we were trying to find the balance between, certainly there is uncertainty and change happening, but there also is some really great activity. And Sam, we might just move on to the next slide where we talk to, this is something at CCS where we have seen take place before. I feel a sense of calm has been with ourselves and our clients over the past 2 years because really we've been through this before. Not necessarily a global pandemic, but over the decades, CCS have supported our clients through recessions, through terrorist attacks, to natural disasters. So we've been able to draw on that experience and really outline here some of our timeless principles. And the main takeaway coming from this is that in times of uncertainty, we know donors do stop giving primarily because they no longer feel connected to the organization. So really, we find it so important to keep talking to your audience, keep them informed, keep them up to date on what's happening. And when the time is right, to really request financial support. So before I hand over to Derval and Laura for our Q&A, we do want to say the point of it's really those organizations that stay the course and engage extensively with their stakeholders who we hope emerge successfully. So with that, I'll hand over to Derval to kick us off.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Maria mentioned, we are delighted that Laura joins us today. And thank you to all of you as well. The audience is quite diverse and organizations are represented across much of the not-for-profit sector, from education to animal welfare through to healthcare and beyond. And we are joined by colleagues from across 6 different countries, so a few time zones within there. It's great that we have the opportunity to talk to Laura today. Maria just gave a flavour of Laura's experience, and hopefully you'll benefit today regardless of the type of organisation you are, the kind of fundraising you've underway, your location, the size of your team, that we would hope at the end of today's call that you will have had some practical insights that you can take away and adapt to your own situation. Laura, as I mentioned, it's great to have you. What we had said in you kindly agreeing to come on, that we would keep this quite informal, so more of a chat rather than a presentation, but maybe to ease us all into the conversation, I thought it'd be helpful, given that vast experience that you have, and it might be a bit of a tricky question, what has been your proudest moment as a fundraiser?
Well, Derval, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. And I can't see everybody, but it's very, it's very nice to be joining you all today. That's not such a hard question for me, because I have a really clear sense of when my most proud moment was. And I think it was when I was first setting out as a fundraiser. I was working at UNICEF UK and establishing a major gift, a leadership gift program there. And my proudest moment was really when I had my first really big and successful ask. And I think, as every fundraiser will know, you kind of know when you've got it right. When you ask that question, you have that confidence to pause, you wait for the response. It doesn't come too quickly, because if it comes too quickly, maybe you've not quite asked enough or slightly misjudged it. And I asked a donor on a field mission. I was out in the field, we were looking at landmines work. I asked the question, there was that pause, and then the answer came back yes. And I have to say, that's what I think that gave me that confidence right from the beginning, that actually this is possible, and that real sense of excitement as well. So yeah, I think that's my proudest moment.
Excellent, and a good one. You mentioned the word confidence a couple of times, and of course that's our theme for today's call. The audience today is primarily frontline fundraisers, so like you out there asking for the money and have the confidence to ask at the right time. What do you think is the key to instilling that confidence in a fundraising team?
Oh, I think this is, I think, we're coming out of a pandemic. We've got a lot of crisis going on at the moment. But for me, the confidence really comes through building a team that feels really enabled. They feel motivated, enthusiastic, inspired, and enabled. And so I think kind of my role, which is no longer a direct face-to-face fundraiser, really, I'm much more behind the scenes, is really trying to kind of put all the pieces together so that the fundraisers have all that they need, the internal obstacles are removed, and they really have the toolkit, the skills, the confidence to reach out, talk to donors, share stories of the work, make the asks. So I think it comes from all of those, from that toolkit, really.
Great. Laura, could you just elaborate a little bit on the toolkit, and if there were 3 or 4 items or tools, what would you suggest they are?
Yeah. Well, I think, as an organisation that's, Human Rights Watch has been through a lot of change recently, and as we're sort of emerging through the pandemic, I think one of the things that we feel is really crucial at the moment for our fundraisers is having a vision, and the organisation having a big vision, or just a very clear vision, something that the fundraisers can really share with their donors, with their prospects, a little bit kind of like, this is on the horizon, this is what we're working to. And we sort of have the stories, and we can illustrate that vision through those stories. But I think having really clear sort of organizational vision and priorities is something that certainly at Human Rights Watch, that fundraisers are feeling incredibly in need of, and they need that kind of clarity. So I think that's kind of one thing. And then I think that when you have that kind of vision from the organization, it's easier for the fundraisers to then build their goals and their priorities behind that. One of the things that we're really thinking about at the moment are, what is the engine of the department? What are the things that the fundraisers really need the most? And part of that is information management and a really strong database. A strong database and understanding of how to use it, something that can really pull quickly and efficiently and easily, all the different data points that the fundraisers need to sort of see that they're making progress, seeing what trends are working. So I would say that's another really important thing as well. I think one of the things that we've really maybe struggled with a bit during the pandemic and being so siloed is, well, two things. One is, I think, about really making the most of the partnerships that exist and should exist across a department and throughout an organization. I think, we've kind of experienced that there's been sort of a bit of duplication of effort in places, and actually trying to bring all that knowledge and best practice together and use it for the benefit of the whole department. And I think the other thing really is about building the prospect pipelines and having a really sort of clear and open conversation and a strong strategy. We used to gather a lot in person. Face-to-face peer networking was how we filled up our prospect pipeline for our major donors, our leadership donors. And I think really having a thoughtful strategy behind that, asking robust questions, making sure we're not making assumptions, understanding what's happening in the wider world and how that impacts.
Great. I wanted to pick you up on two things and maybe put you on the spot a little bit around stories, and certainly the quotation you have in your background. Yeah. So my first question is around the stories and the importance of those in engaging a donor and how you choose which stories, and maybe in some cases the brevity of those stories. So I'll stop my question there to be brief, and then I'll ask my second part.
Yeah, I think in terms of the stories, I think what we are really coming to realize, and actually I have to say this is following conversations that you and I have had that's helped to sort of fine-tune thinking on this, but I think the stories have to be personal and meaningful to the person who's telling them. So in the world of human rights, impact stories can take a long time to get impact. Somebody is called to justice through the International Criminal Court. There's often a lot of sort of fine-tuning and detailed work, but I think the fundraisers who, I think it's for them almost to pick what are the stories that really inspire and motivate them, and then they share them with their donors. And I think that's often how our work is conveyed most compellingly, really. Human rights can be a little bit abstract. So having that personal story and drive, I think, is what can really connect. And then I think our community, our supporters, our networks, they all, we try to encourage them in a way to really, own a piece of our impact themselves and kind of own that story around that.
Great. The second element I wanted to ask you about, you referenced strategy a few times, and I wanted to particularly ask about adapting strategy in light of crisis and understanding Human Rights Watch. Certainly sees its fair share of crisis, but if we consider the pandemic and now more recently the turbulent times we're in, how do you know when and how to adapt your strategy?
I think that's a really good question. I think how and when. I think it's really, there are key moments in the year that you go through kind of planning, and we are definitely in one of those moments at the moment. And there is so much going on at the moment. We are using kind of a matrix, which is basically looks at impact versus complexity. And actually there are certain things in your strategy that you can do that have really high impact, make a real difference, but really quite complex, and they will take a long time to fix and to change and to really sort of delve into. There are other things that are high impact and low complexity, and we're sort of thinking of those as the low-hanging fruit. So our starting point at the moment, and literally we did a big planning session last week, so this all feels very fresh, is that we're trying to identify what is the low-hanging fruit, what is it that we can do to tweak our strategy to make the biggest impact, to give us time, and recognizing that there are things that are much longer term and will take more detailed consultation, sometimes with our donor community, sometimes with our board members. So we're really kind of able to kind of delve deep, and there's more of a kind of a change of direction in terms of strategy. I think in terms of the emergency work, you know, we're still kind of in the horrendous situation with Ukraine at the moment. And I think what we've realized at Human Rights Watch, and we've not been terribly holistic in our emergency strategy in the past, but we've realized that actually this is a time that, you know, we probably will always be in some kind of crisis mode, whether it's, you know, pandemic, environment, you know, conflict. And actually it's really thinking about, we probably need to kind of, you know, we can't really fix these things. We need to adapt, and our strategies need to adapt to embed this aspect into them, you know, going forward, I think.
And how do you balance that then with maintaining that high level of confidence with the fundraisers? So understanding that there are many factors at play here, that they can continue on with that enthusiasm and motivation that you mentioned earlier, that they can continue to fundraise and do so successfly.
Well, I think a lot of our fundraising, because our model is primarily, certainly outside the US, it's primarily leadership gifts. So our fundraisers, it's really about the relationships that they have with these individuals. And actually kind of exactly what Maria was saying at the beginning, it's about talking to the donors. And during the pandemic, we've probably talked to our donors much more than we ever have done in the past. You know, our fundraisers have called their contacts, called their donors and said, how are you doing? You know, there's no ask in there. It's just a genuine, how are you? How are you feeling? And I feel that relationship, those relationships are really, they're kind of more open and honest and more transparent these days. One of my colleagues was telling me that they were having a conversation with one of our leadership donors who basically was saying, at the moment, I just can't fulfill my pledge. The markets are not good. My income is not strong enough. I love the organization. I'm completely here for the long term, but I can't do that. But for one of those stories, there's always the other story, which is actually, you know, the success through the introductions and a low-level donor, somebody who's given modestly in the past. They see something. We've had a lot of coverage about Ukraine. We're not a particularly high-profile organization. We don't have huge name recognition, but our work on Ukraine has lifted that in terms of media citations. And actually, that's given us opportunities that we hadn't realized. We've had people in our midst. We knew they had capacity, but we knew we were never their priority. But actually, through those kind of the media citations, the introductions, those conversations have developed. And so we've had people who've given us small amounts, and one has actually just gone up to, I can probably say it, to $1 million, which we were absolutely thrilled and delighted with. It took a lot of work, a huge amount of work. But I think that those sort of successes and sharing those successes as well as the challenges across the team is really important.
Great, and well done on that gift. You mentioned the opportunities in the Ukraine crisis, is certainly unearthing new donors for Human Rights Watch. That and otherwise across your donor family, have you seen their motivations change for giving over the last couple of years? And indeed, are they asking different questions of you now than they would have done heretofore?
You know, I think where I see this is most is in the big foundations and the institutional foundations. And actually, a lot of them are going through big strategic changes themselves at the moment. So we have, we've participated with some of our existing donors and some of our donors who've lapsed, actually, because they've kind of moved away in terms of their criteria from our sort of goal and our mission. And they've asked us a lot of searching questions. A lot of the conversations have been around partnerships and how we partner with other, in our case, and other activists, geographically specific, not necessarily global activists. They've also asked us about, the partnerships that we have with other organizations in terms of fundraising, in terms of, the actual research work that we do. So I think for that group, that's a very live and active conversation and has been quite sort of formal and process driven. I think for our individual donors, I feel that most of them have really engaged more deeply because we've had those conversations one-to-one, seeing their home, their background. We've been through the same challenges. COVID has been a real leveler from that perspective. We've been through those same challenges. And actually, the work that we did around COVID from the Human Rights Framework, it really touched sort of almost every part of our programmatic work. And so it felt very relevant, I think, to our donors, because we're very much a kind of community networking type organization. I think the main thing is people are like, when can we get together again? And we want to see the next generation of philanthropists coming through and being in our midst. They want the kind of the input, the energy, the enthusiasm, the different life experience from others being part of that as well.
Hey, Laura, just a quick clarifying question about the foundations. Are you getting the sense that they're changing the way they do their grant making, or are they looking for Human Rights Watch to change the way you partner with them?
I think they are. I think some of them are changing how they are doing it. I mean, I think if I'm completely honest, I think that some of them have been seeing kind of international NGOs as being a sort of, they're asking the question, are they necessary? Are they just a kind of link to other partners who are in the field and on the ground? It's not all of them, but I think that they are going through a very robust questioning period at the moment. And as an organization going through similar questions, but in hopefully a really positive way, then it's actually quite useful to have these conversations with the donor community. It can be quite informative and, can give confidence, as I feel we're all heading in the right direction, the same direction.
Laura, we're anxious to open it up to the audience's question, but I have one final one for you before we do so. You are leader of a team of 125 people across many, many countries. So I'm sure even before COVID, the virtual world was nothing foreign to you and the team. But curious now, how do you envision the next 6 to 12 months from a hybrid perspective, certainly interacting with donors and asking for money?
Yeah, I think this is it's a question that I'm sure we don't have a definitive answer to, but it's something that we're still thinking about. We're really conscious that actually the pandemic is still with us in a slightly different kind of phase and everything else. And I think meeting in person, it's really important to kind of balance and to respect the fact that people to have a different perception of risk. And they have a different reality of risk as well. So I think that that's one thing that we are really thoughtful about. We're really looking at how we can sort of streamline our virtual interaction with our donors in one way, so that actually, I think a lot of our donors got, Zoom fatigue. I think everybody's did. But they are quite useful. They are really helpful in terms of, particularly for us as an organization that crosses many sort of jurisdictions and time zones. It is a way that we can be more inclusive, and we can be inclusive for, all sorts of reasons, accessibility reasons, sustainability reasons. And so for us, I think we will always be doing a certain amount I also think with donors, we've had this conversation before, is actually because of that sort of uniqueness of the relationship and the sort of closeness that comes over Zoom, we have been able to make asks, and we have been able to find those little slots in people's times to do that. So I think that is all good. The one piece that we need to really work and focusing on is filling our prospect pipelines, and that does come through so much from small private events. And also in the past we've had big sort of annual dinners, big fundraising annual dinners, and that's been one of our big mechanisms. But we are questioning, we're not making assumptions, we're questioning assumptions, we are diving deep into really using data in a much more active way to look at, how do those gifts come in, and what are the triggers and the pathways for those gifts, and trying to be really to really learn from that, and balance the kind of everything that data can bring us with the sort of the expertise, the instincts, the experience, the opinions of the fundraisers. So I think we're in the mode of balancing that. I suspect we will constantly balance that. It will never be a kind of, a clear thing. We will probably constantly tweak.
Great. Well, Laura, that was very insightful. Thank you very much. As I said, we do want to answer the audience's questions, Maria. So I'm going to turn it over to you, please.
Thanks, Derval. And we have a couple of questions coming in. I encourage everyone to keep submitting them as we run through it for all of our panelists. I might start with a question, Laura, that just picks up on what you were talking about just there now around the events. One of our participants has asked, how large were events part of your fundraising strategy pre-COVID, and how have you adapted and changed that strategy since?
Oh, that's such a good question, because we have, so in our team, as I said, it's a global team, and we would have these annual dinners. And for as long as I've been at Human Rights Watch, which is since 2004, and predating that, these dinners were really the kind of linchpin and the hooks of our fundraising. We would bring our community together, we would really showcase the work, we would really share stories of what we've done, and we would do fundraising in advance, leading up to, on the night, and they were really key. For some of our cities and some of our communities, these events are still really key. We've done them online, we're bringing them back in person. I think the way that the ones where this is really instrumental have adapted is in terms of numbers and capacity. And actually, because I think people are less comfortable meeting in really big groups, 300 people is kind of what they were at some stage, these dinners are becoming smaller. They're becoming quite focused. And actually what we're seeing, because of this sort of slightly different feel about them, is that we're actually seeing smaller number of people coming together. They're cheaper to put on as a consequence, and the average gift per participant is going up. So I think that's one thing. But I think in terms of the cities where we're moving away, it's really, I think the annual dinners and these big events were a bit habitual from our perspective. They were things that were kind of hooks in our strategies that we always used. So really looking carefully at the data, which was like, how dependent has this income been on this gift? And we realized that actually through the kind of deepening of engagement and, conversations about the work, maybe we don't need these so much. And maybe we can spend the money in a slightly different way.
The focus on return on investment, it's music to our ears. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Charlie, just to bring you in here, there's a question around, how do I maintain a positive approach when I'm engaging with our donors around our mission, while they may be focused on other crises around the world?
Thanks, Maria. So from our experience, fundraising is a very positive pursuit in the best of times, the worst of times. Having a message, having a long-term plan, having a near-term plan, communicating that plan, that's really what we've seen to be most effective. There are lots of organizations that can share their mission and kind of relate their mission to what's happening in the world, even if it's not directly impactful on sort of the situation in Ukraine or COVID. We've got clients in, Stanford Symphony Orchestra. You wouldn't think of them as sort of frontline COVID response, but boy, they provided a lot of music and shared it with, care homes and, beamed it to school children. And they had the musicians on the phone talking to patrons, and it was an important part of the kind of COVID response in that part of the world. So I think have a plan, have some key positive message points, make yourself relevant. Don't stop communicating. If anything, like double or triple your communications in times of uncertainty. It's really important to be present.
Yeah, really heartwarming. Dermot, a question that you might take up, one of our participants have asked, how can I instill confidence with our internal leaders and our senior administrators in fundraising? As fundraisers, we're excited, but how do we get others along with us?
Very much back to Laura's point earlier about it's taking that same motivation, enabling, the sharing of the vision, being excited about it, and it's the stories. And I think it's very much not alone the stories, but the impact of them. And Laura spoke a little bit about that as well. So of course, with leaders, it's normally in our experience, a couple of things. It's to give them that a toolkit that Laura referenced, but a slightly different one than the fundraisers. So give them the confidence that they, and it might sound ridiculous statements, but sometimes we hear from board members, well, I don't know quite how to describe what we're doing or why we need the money now. So it's giving them that confidence of that story they should be telling and when that will resonate with them. So that would be the first thing. And second of all, of course, with any leaders, whether they're of managed senior management or indeed of a board or a volunteer committee, time is of the essence. And as fundraisers, how do we not alone give them the confidence, but staff them most appropriately to make this both a positive experience for them, but also too that it's making them best use of their time and their energy. And like anything, when you find that you have some success, maybe start small. So Charlie mentioned about a near-term plan. Maybe in the first instance, you start with them interacting with a few prospects, let them have a couple of quick wins. And all of a sudden, then it changes both their mindset and the scenario that now they're bolstered a little bit more to have greater confidence. Well, God, that wasn't too bad. I might go out and talk to a handful of other people now.
Excellent. Thanks.
Hey, Laura, I was struck when Derval asked you about toolkits. You didn't mention anything about like glossy materials or brochures or letters. You talked about message points and access to a database that would enable the fundraiser to manage their interaction with individuals. I think there's something to take away from that, like, especially in times of crises, like you got to have your frontline fundraisers talking with people. Because that's where the money is. That's where the potential is.
Can I just share a quick story to sort of illustrate? Do I have to?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I referenced a little bit earlier that we had this kind of donor who went from being a very low level donor, somebody on our radar, to giving us $1 million. And when I was talking to the frontline fundraiser who did this, the way she described it was she is the conductor of the orchestra. And actually, she is that focal point. She is the strategist. And the rest of the organization is her orchestra. And she needs to bring in the right people at the right moment, so that actually none of these gifts come in isolation. It's always, you need the full orchestra behind them to really bring them in. I think that kind of came through. And the way she was speaking and thinking about this kind of orchestra of whether they're researchers and advocates, board members, the executive director, they're all members to be brought in at different points.
That's lovely, lovely sentiment. This other question actually for you, Laura, again, it's coming in from one of our participants who's at an international school. And they were asking, do you have any advice for a small team who are reaching out to a community where they're not very philanthropic? So I gather they've just launched their fundraising team during the pandemic, and not many of their community know about them or know what they're about. Would you have any suggestions or thoughts for them?
Oh, I think that's quite hard. I mean, when I first joined Human Rights Watch in 2004, I was kind of London-based, very specific. And actually, it was that kind of, it was looking for that sort of community. And I think with the people that you have, I think it's all about building those relationships. And actually that relationship comes through those conversations, the really sharing the mission and the stories. But I also think it's really important to be direct. One of the things for us is that we are not funded by government. So we take no funding from government, and that's one of our strong selling pieces, if you like. And I think it's knowing what where you add and what your difference is. And just being quite brave about talking about money, because actually I think people expect that, and it's about giving people an opportunity to fund something that they really believe in. So starting those conversations off and just sort of using stories to illustrate. I don't know if that helps. I know it's quite hard to.
It's early days for them, so we wish them best of luck.
Hey, Maria, we're working with a school in the Gulf that had like a similar situation, not necessarily a great, culture of philanthropy was emerging. And they really hit home the message with their alumni and their parents that the highest performing schools globally have a strong culture of philanthropy, and everybody bought into that. And then through benchmarking, they kind of showed families, like, here's some of the schools that are in our peer group, and here's their philanthropy, and we want to emulate that. We want to move in that direction. And taking that objective approach, it was really helpful to them, because the parents wanted to, the alumni wanted to see the school be even more competitive.
Yeah. Well, we should maybe link in with this individual post-call. Please do keep submitting. We've got time for just one or two more questions. Derval, I might ask you just to cover this one off. Individuals asking, what are the key metrics we can look to understand how we're doing and how we can improve? Funds raised, certainly, but what else should we be looking at?
So yes, the obvious one is the money, because the numbers never lie, and that's the ultimate objective. Just a quick story. A number of years ago, we started with a school who had a significant goal, and I had asked the headmaster how many meetings he had over the course of the term, and he had 2. So, and yet he had a goal of 20 million euro. So the lesson there was activity is pivotal. So in order to get to the money, you have to first of all have some metrics around activity. And quite simple ones and obvious ones is how many meetings are you having? How many, or whether it's called virtually or other, how many meetings out of those, how many follow-up steps are needed? So it's tracking it 3 or 4 key things, like obvious elements like that. Because if you have enough activity, and we all understand being fundraisers that, to put it crudely, fundraising is a numbers game. And it's about selling and numbers, and Laura had referenced the pipeline a few times. So you need to have enough activity in the pipeline in order to get to those targets. And we're firm believers in breaking everything down into manageable pieces. So yes, in that school, you might have a goal of 20 million euro, but how are you going to get to the first 1 million, the next 5 million, etc.? And what activity is needed? And Laura had mentioned the importance of data and using it to your benefit, to work smartly, not to paraphrase Laura, but to work smartly and efficiently. So it's choosing some metrics, watching those trends over a short period of time, and taking a step back and seeing, first of all, are they the right metrics to be following? And second of all, what's working and what isn't, and how do you adapt? Because there's no point sitting there in 6-12 months' time with the same metrics if they're not doing you any service. So it's to see that, well, actually, we thought we needed to have make 5 phone calls to get 3 meetings, but actually it's taken us 7 phone calls. Well, then you need to adapt and look at your numbers again.
Excellent. Thank you, Derval. Laura, the question has come in about motivating your fundraisers if they've had a knockback. How do you keep them motivated and encouraged to keep going?
Oh, well, I think, everybody gets knockbacks. And I think that's just the kind of reality of it. But I think that from, if something doesn't work out, then, it's never anybody's fault. Actually, you have to sort of it's great that people try new things and do new things. And actually, I think kind of knockbacks are a learning opportunity. I think it's, we really evaluate you know, successes, but also things that just haven't worked. And we share that as well, because actually one of the things that I really enjoy about Human Rights Watch is that the fundraisers, they're not in competition with each other. There is no sort of like ownership of a particular donor. Somebody may own the strategy, but everybody has responsibility for moving that strategy forward in whatever way that it is. So I think, you know, I think it's like, yes, if something doesn't go well, pulling out the points, you know, questioning, diving deep, rethinking them. But I think it's, you know, fundraising is always a team effort. So it should never fall on one person either. I think kind of the responsibility, you know, the success or the failure, it's that orchestra approach again, I think.
And it's nice and humble to say we've all had knockbacks. It happens to every best of us. A question has come in, actually just linked, Derval, to one of the piece around internal leadership. One of our participants is asking about board education and how can you ensure they get more involved in activities such as corporate sponsorship and individual donor fundraising. Do we have any examples or stories we can share of where we've seen that succeed and the timeline for that?
Sure, Maria, and it really comes down to a couple of things, is that it's not a one size fits all for many boards, because in fairness to them, sometimes when they were recruited, they didn't necessarily understand that fundraising was part of their remit. So sometimes there's that cultural shift and a change of mindset. So it'll be, first of all, it's not one size fits all, and also too, it will take time. And that will depend on a number of factors. However, often what is common is back to that word of confidence, that very often board members aren't quite sure what you're asking them to do and may not have the tools to know how to even speak to a potential donor, which may seem a bit silly, but they do want to. There's a reason they're on the board. They're very proud of the organization, I'd imagine, and they want to make sure its reputation continues to thrive. So they want to do well by the organization. So us as part of the onus is on us as fundraisers to give them those tools to understand that, yes, they have a role. And very often when they feel that, oh my God, I could never ask anybody for money, or be mortified if I made an introduction, would Laura ask them for £1 million and I'd be mortified, etc., is that many of them, if you think of what you're asking them to do, there's probably 3 or 4 elements to it. And the first is that they are speaking passionately and positively about the organization. And chances are they're doing that in some way now. And it's just, how do you put maybe a bit more refinement or sophistication, not to be disrespectful, around that message or the stories they're telling. So everybody can do that. And as I say, they're on the board for a reason. Second of all, we often hear, well, I don't know anybody, or I certainly don't know anybody with financial capacity. And of course, that's an immediate reaction when you say to someone, well, who should we be talking to? Well, I don't know. However, if you show these are the kind of companies, you talked about company sponsorship, these are 10 companies that we feel would be interested in our organization for this reason. It's not a comprehensive list. Do you know anybody on it? And straight away, if they don't know anybody, it might be, well, I don't know anyone in here, but you know who you don't have on there is such a company. And then, of course, your next question is, well, then would you be willing to open the door on our behalf? And then it comes to comfort level. And it's easier to ask somebody to do things if you give them options. So the ideal scenario is that they would pick up the phone and say, I'm involved in this wonderful organization. We'd like to meet with you, talk a little bit more about our mission. They may be willing to do that. That would be ideal. Even better if they'd come on that meeting with the fundraiser. And then thirdly, be involved every step of the way. And by what I mean by options is, that's the ideal scenario, or maybe they'll allow you to use their name. And that Joe Bloggs is a board member, he suggested I contact you. So there's different ways they can help, and it's building up their confidence and doing so incrementally. I think part of your question was, how long does it take?
Yeah.
We have seen it change quite quickly with some individuals once they know what's been asked of them. So it's to be clear with them and to be fair with them what the expectations are. So anywhere from immediate to maybe 6 months, perhaps longer, depending on comfort levels.
Excellent, Derval, thank you. And we're coming up onto the close of the session, but I just want to squeeze in one final question, if that's okay. And Laura, I might hand it over to you just to close us out. It's around as CEO, how can I ensure I'm giving time to strategy? I find I can get easily distracted by day-to-day activities. Any advice you'd have for leaders to stay strategically focused?
Oh, do you know, and I think this is Yeah, I think this is one of the key things to successful fundraising. And actually at Human Rights Watch, we've had our executive director who is just leaving after 30 years, kind of in the lead. And he has dedicated a huge amount of time to our fundraising strategy. We sadly think that will probably no longer be the case. But I think it's about really knowing the fundraisers. He really knew all our fundraisers and completely trusted their expertise. So he read every brief and he delivered on brief perfectly, never shied away from asks, because I think he had the right tools. So I think it's that relationship with the fundraisers, being available, being accessible, but also they have the responsibility to use the CEO in a very strategic way, I think. Yeah. And just being interested.
And sounds like a great team around him as well, which always helps. Right. Well, look, we are up in the hour. I could keep asking questions for the rest of the day, but I will be respectful of everyone's time, and we will leave it there. So all that's left to say is thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you did find the session beneficial. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact myself, Derval, or Charlie, or Laura. We gladly pick up on those. Everybody will receive a recording of today's session, and that should come out to you by the end of the day. So with that, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all.
Laura, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you,
everyone. Take care.